In this video, we will build a simple to-do app with the Flask and Vue.js, where synchronous calls to Flask backend will be performed with the fetch function. It's just a vanilla Flask, SQLAlchemy to deal with the SQLite database, and Vue.js without components. Let's install Flask. And now to create a Flask app, I just need to create a Python file. Let's say it'll be just app.py. The app.py file is the file that Flask, the second version, uses by default as the main file of your Flask application. Here, first of all, I want to import the Flask class. Then let's create an instance of the Flask class, the app variable, Flask, and as an argument it takes the name of the file, that is __name__. Flask uses it to build paths to its resources like HTML and other static files. And in the if main block, I want to call the run method. Well, I don't want to reload the development server each time I change the project files, so I have to turn on the debug mode. I can do it by exporting the environment variable Flask debug by using the .env file or .flaskenv file. But firstly, I have to install the python.env package. Now let's create the .flaskenv file, .flaskenv. And inside it, let's define the Flask debug variable, Flask debug, in uppercase and set it to 1. And if you use the different file name for the main file of your project, not app.py file, you have to define the Flask app variable too, Flask app, and its value should be the name of your file without extension. In my case, it's the app. By default, Flask will automatically use these flaskenv and .env files, but for production we have to call the load.env function manually. So let's import it to the app.py model from .env import load.env, and let's just call it load.env. And as an argument I have to pass the path to the flaskenv file, flaskenv. This dot means the current folder. Okay, let's run the development server. Flask run command, and we can see that debug mode is on. Okay. Now let's return something as the response. So I'm defining a new function, the index function, that will return a string with HTML tags h1 hello world h1. The index function is a handler of users' requests to a certain page. To define the address of that page, I have to use the route decorator. app.route. If you're unfamiliar with the decorator's concept, consider watching of my short tutorial on that topic. And as an argument, it takes the URL address. I want to use \, that stands for the root URL address. Save, and let's refresh the page, and we can see our hello world h1 header. And now I want to use an HTML template. Let's create the templates folder. Templates. It's the default folder where Flask will look for templates. I want to use the base HTML template, as the base templates of the project that will be extended by more specific index.html template. So let's create the base HTML, and also let's create the index.html. In the base HTML, I want to use a basic HTML layout, and to render content from index.html file, I have to use the block tags. Block and then the name of this block. I use the content name, you can use any name you want. And in the index.html file, I'm specifying that this index.html extends the base HTML. Curly braces, % characters, extends base HTML. And to render the contents of the index.html file to the base HTML file, I have to specify the block tag again with the same name I used in the base HTML template. In the base file, I used the content name, so I have to use the same name here. And let's repeat the hello world. And now the index view function will render the index template. To do it, we have to use the render template function that we need to import first. Render template. And the index function will return its result, render template. The first argument is the name of the template I want to render, index.html. Okay, let's refresh the page, and nothing changed, but we can see full HTML layout for this page. Okay, and now let's get a link to the Bootstrap CSS files and add it to our base HTML template. I need the getbootstrap.com website, and I need this link. Copy it and paste it somewhere here. Okay. Now I want to create the static folder next to the templates folder. And this static folder will store my CSS and JS files. So let's create the styles CSS inside it, styles CSS, and main.js. Main.js. To be sure that they are linked to the project successfully, I want to add to the styles CSS some rule, for example, body background gray, for example. And to main.js, let's call the console log function. Something like this. Now I want to generate a link to style CSS. I need the base template, then link tag, and the href attribute will have the following value. I have to use doubled curly braces, and inside them I'm calling the URL for function. It gets the name of the folder, static, and the file name I want to use, styles CSS. Let's refresh the page, and we can see the background became gray. Great, let's remove this rule. And the same way I want to link main.js file, but I need the script tag this time. And I need to add the src attribute. It's a link to the JS file. So I do the same. I'm calling the URL for function. It takes the static folder as the first argument, and the file name as the second. It's a main.js. Inspect console, and we can see our console logged message. Let's remove it from our main.js file. And also I wanted to use Vue.js for this project, so let's open official Vue.js file. I need get started, I need 3.x and the installation section. cdn, just copy this link to our base HTML file somewhere here. By the way, I want to move our main.js file down before the closed body tag, because I want to have it loaded after the Vue.js library will be loaded. Okay, then in the base HTML file, I want to wrap this content block with the Bootstrap divs. I want to have the container div that will have the raw div. Also, I want to have a div block with 6 Bootstrap columns width, so it will be col6 class. And also I want to have the content centered. It's the mx auto class, and I want to have margin from top at 5 Bootstrap units. Something like this. Let's refresh the page. Okay. All requests to the root URL address will be handled by index function. And let's pass something to the template from our index view. Let's say it'll be the name variable. It's just a demonstration. John Smith. And the render template function will take the name parameter with the name variable as the value. The name parameter of the render template function is the name of the variable that we will use in the index template. This parameter can have any name you want, it's just a variable name. To use it in the index.html file, I have to use doubled curly braces. And then I use the name variable. This one, F5. And now we can see the value of the name variable that was defined in the index view. Here. Now I want to modify the HTML layout of the project. So the layout will have one main part. It will be a div block with the app ID that will have 2 children parts. The first one is the form with an input field and a button. And the second part is just a container for all tasks. So I need the index.html file. Let's get rid of this title. And I need the main container, a div block with the app ID. This div will be bound with the Vue.js objects. Then the first part is the form. You can use Bootstrap forms from documentation. I quickly do almost the same, and the emmet plugin will help me. So the form will be with standard Bootstrap classes. And it will have one div block with the form group and the raw CSS classes. Form group and the raw. This row will have 2 columns, left and right. The left one with a label tag and an input field, and the right column will have only a button. So I need to use a parenthesis. Parenthesis means a group of elements, because I want to have 2 columns inside it. So the left column will have a div with a col9 CSS class. It will be just a container for columns. And this col9 div will have 2 children divs. where the first one is a label with a create new task text. Label. The text is inside curly braces. And the label will have a sibling tag, an input field with the form control class. Sibling tags are those which have a common parent tag. So to indicate that I need a sibling tag to previous tag, I have to use the plus character and the input with form control CSS class. And this call9 div, this one, will have a sibling div 2 plus. It'll be a div with call auto and empty auto CSS classes. Auto, margin from top, auto. The empty auto class means that this div will be aligned from top automatically, and the call auto class means that the div will take as much space as needed. And at last, this div will have the button with btn and btn success CSS classes. And I think that the text of the button will be create, and I am expanding it. Let's add the type to the button. Type will be submit. Okay, the form is ready, and the same way I want to create a card for a task. My main container for cards will have a margin from top at 5 Bootstrap units, so empty 5, and it will have a child with the card class. That will have a child div with a card body class. And the card body div will contain the text of the task and the close button. I want to push its text and close button to left and right edges of the card body container. I can do it by adding the raw CSS class and the justify content between class. Between. And the card body div will have the close button with the btn close class. Button type submit btn close class. And I am expanding this formula. And let's add some text here before the button. Okay, let's add paddings. Card body div will have also px4. Okay. And now I think that it's time to create a Vue.js object and try its data rendering. So let's open main.js file, and the Vue class has the createApp method that I want to assign to the createApp constant. So const createApp Vue. Then let's define an object that will be used by Vue.js library. Const taskApp, for example. It's the name of this object, of this dictionary. And then I want to create a Vue instance from this taskApp object. I'm calling the createApp function that we imported here. And I am passing into it the taskApp object, this dictionary. Then I want to bind the Vue object with an HTML tag. We can do it by calling the mount method and passing into it the HTML tag identifier. I used the ID attribute with the app value. So it's a string hashtag means ID, and I want to use the def with the app ID. Like I said here, ID app. And then the task app object must have the data function that will return an object, a dictionary. So let's create the data that will return an object with a key message, and the value of this key will be hello world, for example. Let's use this message variable in our template for a while. Somewhere before the form, but inside the def with the app ID, I want to use h1 and doubled curly braces to render the value of the message key. Let's refresh the page. And there is no hello world message because of a conflict between Flask and Vue. They use the same doubled curly braces delimiters. And we can set our own delimiters for Vue. So after the data function, I want to add the delimiters key. Delimiters. It's a list of strings. And as delimiters for Vue, I want to use single curly braces. And every time I need to render a value of a Vue object key, I will use this single curly braces. So let's save the main.js file and here use just single curly braces. F5, and we can see our hello world message that was rendered by Vue.js but not Flask. Okay. Let's get rid of this h1 header. Now let's define a new key in the data dictionary. Let's say it will be the task key with some value. New task, for example. And now I want to render the value of the task key in the template. So instead, do nothing. Let's render the task. F5. Okay, new task. One of the main features of Vue.js framework is the reactivity of data. To show it, let's add to the input tag the vModal attribute, vModal, that will have the task as the value. The task here is the name of the key in the data dictionary. This one. Vue.js manipulates a DOM via special attributes that are called directives. And one of its directives is the vModal attribute that establishes two-way data binding between HTML tag and the data dictionary. Let's look at it. F5, and we got the new task from our task key, and if we will input something in the input field, we can see immediate rendering of the value attribute of the input field. Okay, the next step is to render a number of elements that have the same layout. So let's assume that we have several tasks. And in Flask that uses Jinja2 templater, we can iterate through a list of objects with a special for filter, and Vue can do the same. So let's add to the data dictionary a new key, the tasks key. It will be a list of dictionaries, an array of objects as you wish. So the first will be a dictionary with the title key, and the value of this title will be 1. Then the second one will have the 2 value of the title key, comma. And now I want to create a card layout for each element of the task's list and render the value of each title key. And we can do it with the v4 directive. I need the index.html, and I am adding to the card def a new attribute, v4, and the value of this attribute will be a definition of the for loop like in Python. For v4 task in tasks, and on each iteration of the for loop, the task variable will get an element of the task's list that's a dictionary, an object. And also, when we are using for loops in templates, we have to use a unique identifier for each element of the list we iterate through. For this purpose, we can use the index of each element. Index. And we have to specify that we want to use the index for it. I am adding the key, key attribute that gets the index as the value, this index. And so the text of each card will be the task. It's a dictionary, an object, and I need its title attribute. Let's test it. F5, and we can see 1 and 2. Let's add MB3 CSS class to our card. Margin from bottom at 3 units. Okay. And let's delete the new task from here. An empty string. Okay. Our tasks are rendered successfully, and so it's time to create a couple of tasks and send them to front-end to display to a user. To do it, I want to create a model, and then I'll create a couple of tasks with a Python shell for a while. To deal with the database, I want to use SQLAlchemy or IAM. Let's install it. Pip install Flask-SQLAlchemy. Now I want to create a new config.py file to store some settings of my database. And in this file, in the config.py file, I want to create a config class config. Then I want to add a new SQLAlchemy database URI property in uppercase, and this variable will have the following value. First of all, I have to specify the database I will use. I want to use the SQLite database. So, SQLite colon and 3 slashes. And then I have to specify the name and location of the database I want to use. The SQLite database is just a file, and so I have to specify the absolute path to that file. To do it, we can use the same idea like in Django. First of all, let's import the path class from pathlib imports path. Then I'm creating the base dir variable. It will be an instance of the path class. And I'm passing into the path class the file variable to_before file to_after the name. And the base dir is a path to the current config.py file. Print base dir. And we can see the full absolute path to this config.py file. To get the path of the folder, I have to call the parent property. Parent. And we can see absolute path to the app folder, the current folder of this project. And to get the absolute path to my database file, I have to call the join path method of the base dir variable plus base dir. I'm calling the join path and specifying here the name of the file, the name of the database db SQLite, for example. And then I have to convert this path object to a string. Okay. Then in the app.py module, first of all I want to import the config class from the config module. Config import config. And to load the config class I want to use the from object method. The app has the config dictionary and it has the from object method, and I am passing into it the config class, this one. Now let's import the SQLAlchemy class from Flask _ SQLAlchemy, import SQLAlchemy. SQLAlchemy is an ORM system that stands for Object Relational Mapping. The main idea of the Object Relational Mapping is that we can use Python objects classes to describe schema of a relational database. ORM is a layer of a more abstract logic over a certain SQL language that helps us to describe data that we want to store in a database with Python classes, and these classes are called models. Now I want to create an instance of the SQLAlchemy class. Somewhere here, let's create the db variable. It will be an instance of the SQLAlchemy, and I am passing into its init method the app variable, the instance of the Flask class. The server is started, and we can see deprecation warning that SQLAlchemy track modifications property should be explicitly set to true or false. So let's open our config.py file and add here a new property, SQLAlchemy track modifications, and I want to set it to false. Okay, now let's add a model to the project. I am creating a new models.py file. Here I need to import the app module because I need the db variable. And now let's create the task class that will represent our task in the database. It's a subclass of the model class. So I have to use the app module. I import it. I need the db variable that was defined there. It's an instance of the SQLAlchemy class. And I need the model class, model. Then I want to specify the properties of the task. For more detailed explanations, consider watching of my Flask tutorial. But right now I want to have an ID of each task, a title, the date of its creation, and the completed property. So the ID property will be an instance of the column class, app db column, and its type will be integer, app db integer. I have to call it, and it will be the primary key. Then the title. The title will be just a string. Column, string, 140 characters length, and that's it. The date property will be the date time type, date time by default it will be set to the result of the now function from the date time module. Let's import it from date time, import date time. The default will be the result of the datetime now function, and the completed property will be the boolean property, boolean type, default value will be false. I forgot to close my parentheses. That's it. Now I have to define the init method. It will get any positional and keyworded arguments, args, and 2 stars key w args, keyworded args. Then I have to call the init method of the parent class of our task model, that is, the init method of the model class. I'm calling the super function, and then I'm calling the init method and passing into it the args and the w key args. Also, let's add the wrapper representation method that will return an f string task self ID and maybe self title. Okay, now we need to create a table in the database and create a couple of tasks. So I need Python shell. Python First of all, I have to import the task model from the models module. From models, import task. I have this print because I forgot to delete this from config.py model. The task was imported. Now I have to import the DB variable, an instance of the SQLAlchemy class. From app, import DB. Okay. Now to create the database file and the task table in the database, I have to call the createAll method. DB createAll. Enter. And we got the DB SQLite file. The database was created. And now I want to create a couple of tasks. For example, T1 will be an instance of the task class. The title will be new task 1, for example. And T2, the second task. Then I have to add these instances of the task class to the database session object. For more details, consider watching of my Flask tutorial. DB session and T1, the same for T2. And to write the task to the database, I have to call the commit method of the session object. DB session commit. Okay, we got no exceptions, and it means that the tasks were written to the database. T1, for example, we can see the ID of the T1. Now let's get all tasks from the database. Task query all. And we can see a list with all tasks. Let's get a task by its title. for example, T task query filter. Then I want to get a task instance with the title that contains 1, for example. The filter method returns a base query object that behaves like a list, and we can iterate through it in for loops. Or we can call the all method to get a list. All. Or we can call the first method to get the first element of the base query object. And I got the task with 1 in its title. Well, and now I'm going to display to a user all saved tasks. I have to change a bit my index view function. And here in the app.py module, I have to use the task class from the models module. So let's import models. Import models. Let's restart the server. Yep. And I got an exception about the circular imports. Because I want to import the models module that uses the db variable that is not defined at line 8. It is defined here on line 17. And so I want to move the import of models after the db variable will be created. I forgot to save my file. Let's run it again. Okay. And then in the index function, I want to get all saved tasks. Tasks that equals to models variable, models module. Then I need the task class, query, all. Let's get rid of this name parameter. We don't need it anymore. But and then I have to return the tasks variable to our browser, to our client. But I have to send to my frontend a JSON serializable object. That is, it should be a list of dictionaries, where each dictionary should represent a task object with all its attributes. At the present moment, the all method returns a list of task objects, but not dictionaries. And I think that the easiest way to serialize task objects, that is to convert them to dictionaries, is to use the data class decorator for the task model, and then just return the result of the JSONify function in our view. So I need the models py module, and I have to import from data classes, import the data class decorator. And I want to decorate my task class, data class. And then I want to define a set of attributes for the model. The ID will be integer, the title is a string, the date is the date time, and the completed is boolean. And after that, in the app.py module, I have to import the JSONify function. From Flask, import JSONify. And the returning value of the index function will be the result of the JSONify function, and I am passing into it the tasks variable. Okay, let's refresh the page. And we can see that the form has disappeared and there is only our JSON list with the 2 tasks. But I want to have the form on the page, and also I want to send to my frontend the tasks list when it will be needed. To fix it, I have to check whether the request from the browser is an AJAX request or not. I can do it by checking the request's headers. So let's import the request object. Request. And in the index function, I want to check the header dictionary of the request object, whether the X requested with the header has the XML HTTP request value or not. Somewhere here. If request headers is a dictionary, so I am calling the get method to get the value of the header, and I need the X requested with the header, and if its value is equal to XML HTTP request, then I want to return this JSONified list. Otherwise, I want to return the result of the render template function. I want to use the get method here because the request object might have no this header at all, and otherwise I will get an exception. But if the request object won't have the requested with the header, I just want to get the false in this case. So if the request object has the requested with the header and its value will be XML HTTP request, then I want to return the JSON object with this JSONify function. Otherwise, I want to render the index template. So let's test it. F5. Okay, we can see the form and our tasks that were defined in the Vue object. Now the front-end part. We need to get all tasks from our Flask app and display them to a user. So I have to perform a GET request to the Flask app when the page is loaded. To do it, I want to use the created lifecycle hook of the Vue object. It will be called after the Vue object will be created. So after data, I want to use the created hook. It's a function. And then in the methods dictionary, let's define it, methods, comma. In the methods dictionary, I want to create a function that will perform the GET request to our Flask app. Let's say it'll be the GET tasks function. Here I'm going to create the response variable that will be the result of the fetch function. Const response fetch. I am calling the fetch function. It will perform requests to Flask backend. So the URL address, the first argument, is just a window location because I use the root address for my Flask app. But the server never responds immediately, and the call of the fetch function is a blocking operation. And so the call of the fetch function should be asynchronous. I have to await until the server will respond. So await. And accordingly, the getTasks method should be asynchronous too. So it's async. By default, the fetch function performs GET requests. But for the sake of the demonstration, I want to specify the HTTP method explicitly. And so the fetch function will take as the second argument a dictionary, an object, where the method key will be get method. Gets. Then I described in the index function of our Flask app that the GET request will contain X requested with a header. So I want to add the headers key. Headers. It's a dictionary tool. And here the first key is the X requested with the header, and the value will be XML HTTP request. Okay, after that I will get from the index function a list with the tasks, so I have to convert this list to a JSON object. So this tasks is this list. I am awaiting the result of the fetch function response, and I am calling the JSON function that will convert the response from the Flask to the JSON object. After that, I want to call this get tasks method from the created hook. Await this get tasks, and it should be async to async, and that's all. Let's test it. Let's remove this tasks and let's refresh the page, and nothing, because I have a typo somewhere. Created lifecycle hook is created, F5, and now we can see all tasks that we created in Python shell. Then my further steps will be the following. I have to save to a database a new task from a user. Of course, I have to return to the Vue object an updated list of all tasks that have already been saved in a database. Then, if a user clicks on a card, then the Vue object should send a request to Flask to update its state. I think it will be completed, maybe. And if a user clicks on the close button, I want to send a request to delete this certain instance of the task class. So let's turn back to the Flask side. And now I want to create a form for my task model, because I have to validate a user's input data. To do it, I want to install WT Forms library, and then I want to create the forms.py file. Forms.py. Here I need to import the form class and the string field class. From WT Forms, import form and string field class. Now let's create a new class. It will be task form. It will be a subclass of the form class. The form class will generate an HTML form for the task model, but I won't use the generated HTML because the form is already created. All I need here is the form validation on the Flask side. The task form class will have only one property, the title, because it's only data that a user will submit through the form. It's an instance of the string field class title. Now let's add a validator. From WT Forms, validators, import data required. And let's pass the data required validator into the string field class. Validators parameter, it's a list of instances of validators. So I put here the data required and call it. And now I need to create a new Vue function that will handle requests for creating new tasks. So in the app.py model, let's import the task form class. Firstly, from forms, import task form. To create a new task instance, I have to receive from a user a new task title. When the user submits the form, he will perform a post request to the Flask app. And so on the Flask side, I have to implement the Vue function that will handle post requests. I want to create a new separate function, the create task function. Def create task. The route will be create, and this time I have to explicitly set the method's parameter. It's a list with only post element for this function. Methods post. Then I have to create an instance of the task form class. Task form. Then I want to pass into the task form class the data that user inputted in the HTML form. It's a data. The data parameter is the data that the user sends to the app through the Vue request. To get the data from the request object, I have to call the getJSON method that will return a dictionary. So let's define a new variable user input. For example, I need the request object, and I'm calling the getJSON function. It will return a dictionary. I want to call the getJSON method here, because a bit later I will use a special content type header for a post request that will have an application JSON value. And Flask will automatically deserialize it to a Python dictionary. Okay, now I have to pass the user input variable to the task form class. User input. Now I want to validate the form whether a user inputted something or not. To do it, I have to call the validate method. If form validates, if it's true, if it's valid, then I want to create an instance of the task class. Models task. It should get the value of the title attribute of the form variable. So the title will get the value of the form title data. We described that the task form objects will have the title attribute. This title. Okay, we got the task object. And then I have to save the task object to the database. db session add task db session commit. And let's return the JSONified task object. If the form is not valid, if a user didn't input something but clicked on the create button, the form will be not valid. If it's not valid, then I want to redirect the user to the index view. So I have to import the redirect and the URL for functions. Okay, now let's back to the Vue side. Main.js. I've got the backend ready to accept data from the Vue object. Now I need to send a request to Flask with the user's data to create a new task. That'll be a post request. But firstly, I want to correct a bit the structure of the task attribute of the Vue instance. So the task key of the data object will be a dictionary, an object, with the title key, title. And as I changed the structure of the task key, I want to use the binding with the task title key in the template, of course. So input module task title. And now let's create a new method. Let's say it'll be the create task method. It should be asynchronous because I want to send a request to the server. And it will be a good idea to get all actual data from the server before I perform a new request. So I am calling the getTasks method here. Await this getTasks. This keyword refers to the Vue instance. After that, I'm going to call the fetch function again, and it will have almost the same arguments like in the case with the getTasks method. So const response, the result of the fetch function, await of course, window location plus create. The window location will return the domain with a slash, with the trailing slash, like this. And so I use here the create without slash. Then methods post headers. I need this one, and also I need the content type header, application JSON. Then the body of the request will be the value of the task key of the data object. So after the headers, I have to use the body. JSON stringify this task. It will send the request, Flask will handle it, and now I want to get an updated tasks list, so I'm calling the getTasks method again. Await this getTasks. Now I want to have the submit event handler that will perform a post request with this data to my Flask app. So I need the index.html, and here I am adding the submit attribute to the form tag. Add submit. That equals to the name of the method of my Vue object that I want to call. It's the create task method. And also I want to prevent default behavior of my browser with the prevent modifier, submit.prevent. Because if the action attribute of the form is omitted, browsers will perform a GET request to the address that is present in its address bar. To this address. And the default request will be a GET request because my form has no method attribute to. So I have to use the prevent modifier. Okay, let's test it. F5. Something goes wrong. The route should have a slash here. F5. Okay. New task 3. Enter. And we got a new task. Okay. It works. Actually, here should be a CSRF protection But to keep this tutorial simple, I want to omit using of CSRF tokens with Flask for now. By the way, maybe you have noticed some code redundancy here. My both methods are doing almost the same. I mean, they get tasks and create task methods. The difference is just in headers and in the body of request. So I want to define a more general method that will perform any request we want. I want to define it at the beginning of the methods dictionary. And let's name it something like send request. That will take URL, the method, and the data. Then in the body of the method I have to define headers for my request. I want to use the headers object for now. Const my headers, for example. It's an instance of the headers class that takes a dictionary as an argument with the headers that are common for all requests. I think that it's a content type and X requested this headers. And then I am going to perform a request. Const response equals to await. I am calling the fetch function. The URL will be URL. The method will be method. The headers will be my headers variable and body will be data. And the function will return a response. Return response. And now I want to correct the get tasks and the create tasks method. So get tasks now. Await this send request. Window location as a URL. The method will be get. Okay, it's working, and the create task will be almost the same. Await this send request. Window location plus create. The method will be post and the data will be JSON stringify this task. Okay, it's working. And let's clean the input field after the form will be submitted. I can do it in the create task. After that, I want to this task title will be equal to an empty string. Okay. And the last steps. I want to delete a task and I want to complete a task. So I need two new Flask views and two Vue.js methods. So let's start with Vue.js delete task method. Async delete task. It will get the task object. Here I just call the send method. Await this send method. Send request, sorry. Window location plus delete. We will create it a bit later. Then it will be the post method, and the body will be stringified task object. And again, I want to call this get tasks method, await, of course. Then in the index.html file, I have to set an onClick event handler for the close button. So I am adding a new attribute, @click, for the close button, and the value of the @click attribute will be the name of the method that will handle this onClick event. It will be the delete task method, delete task. And it takes the task as an argument. Let's pass into it the task variable, this task object. And at last I have to create a new delete task function on the Flask side. So I need the app.py file. Let's define a new function. App route will be /delete, methods will be post, first of all, to delete an object from a database, I have to know its ID or other unique property. And as we described in the index function, our front end gets a list of task objects as they are saved in the database, with the date, with an ID, and so on. And in its turn, the delete task method of our Vue sends to Flask app a stringified task object. So I have to get this task object from the request object. Task ID. I need the request object. I'm calling the getJSON method. The getJSON will return a dictionary. I'm calling its get method, and I need the value of the ID key. And now I have to fetch an instance of the task from the database by its ID. We can do it by calling the filter by method. So task will be models task class, query, filter by, and I need the ID, the task with ID that equals to task ID variable, this one. And I need the first element in this base query object, the first and the only element. And to delete the task object instead of the add method of our DB variable, I have to call its delete method. So DB session delete task, DB session commit. And the returning value will be just a dictionary and maybe the code. Return JSONify, something like this. Results ok. I don't know. The code. Let's test it. F5. And we can see that we can delete objects. F5. There is no any task in our database. Okay, it's working. And the last action I need to implement, I want to have a double click event handler to complete a task. So I need new methods. Let's start with the Vue.js parts again. I'm creating a new function, async complete task, and it will be completely the same as the delete task method, so I just copy and paste it here. Then the name will be complete task, complete URL, the method will be post, and that's it. Then in the index.html file, I want to set the double-click event handler on the card body tag. dbl click that equals to the complete task function that gets the task object. And also I want to add an additional CSS class for those tasks that are completed. To do that, I am adding a new attribute to the card body def. It will be the column class attribute, and I want to add the completed CSS class if the task object has the completed property set to true. By default, the completed property equals to false. So the key, it takes a dictionary, it takes an object, and the key of this object is the name of the CSS class I want to add, and the value is a condition of its using, task completed. And now the Flask side. So let's define a new Vue function. And then again I need to get the ID of the task object and to fetch the task instance from the database. Then I need to set the completed property to true and save it to the database again. Session add task db session commit, and I want to return something to Vue frontend. Return JSONify something like this, the code. And also let's add some style to our CSS styles. So the completed class will be the text decoration line through. That's it. Let's test it. F5. Double click. Doesn't work. Completed. F5. The condition task completed property. Class completed. Task completed. Okay. If you like the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.